All right, I invite you to listen along as Rebecca reads our first passage.
The first lesson is from Romans chapter 12, verses 1 through 13. Therefore, I urge you, brothers and sisters, in view of God's mercy, to offer your bodies as a living sacrifice, holy and pleasing to God. This is your true and proper worship. Do not conform to the pattern of this world, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind. Then you will be able to test and approve what God's will is, his good, pleasing, and perfect will. For by the grace given me, I say to every one of you, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment in accordance with the faith God has distributed to each of you. For just as each of us has one body with many members, and these members do not all have the same function, so in Christ we, though many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. We have different gifts according to the grace given to each of us. If your gift is prophesying, then prophesy in accordance with your faith. If it is serving, then serve. If it is teaching, then teach. If it is to encourage, then give encouragement. If it is giving, then give generously. If it is to lead, do it diligently. If it is to show mercy, do it cheerfully. Love must be sincere. Hate what is evil. Cling to what is good. Be devoted to one another in love. Honor one another above yourselves. Never be lacking in zeal, but keep your spiritual fervor serving the Lord. Be joyful in hope, patient in affliction, faithful in prayer. Share with the Lord's people who are in need. Practice hospitality. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you, Rebecca. Well, we're going to continue this series of supporting roles, finding our place in God's grand story. If you were here last week or listened to the sermon, you know we talked about Hagar, the God who sees, the first person to give God a nickname. God who sees. Yeah. We talked about Hagar being put two very important questions were put to her. Where have you come from and where are you going? And those questions inform all of our stories. In fact, they can inform almost every story. Well, today we're going to look at a character. We're skipping forward about 450 years, and we're going to look at someone who played a supporting role, but was not happy to do so. She wanted to be the star, and that's not always easy to be. Somebody once asked the great conductor Leonard Bernstein, what is the most difficult instrument to play? And you know what he said? Second fiddle. It's really hard. It's hard to find anyone who wants to be in a second chair that plays their instrument with as much enthusiasm and diligence and excellence as the ones who are all applying for the first chair. But then he says this. He says, without the second chair, there is no harmony. There'll be no harmony. Now, sometimes we don't like playing second fiddle either. What happens then is that this thing of envy wells up in us, grows up in us. We want what others have, and sometimes we act in ways that seek to harm them or to promote ourselves. It's out of whack with how things ought to be. Yesterday, Laura and I went down to Dane Street Beach and found a plot of shade under a tree and felt the sea breeze. Most of the time there's a sea breeze. Just to be away from the house and mark the 4th. And at one point we got so hot we waded in the water a little bit. I overheard a guy was there with his dog and throwing a stick out, and someone approached him and says, that's your dog? Yeah. The guy says, yeah, I watched this. He's learned a new trick. And he takes driftwood and he throws it out as far as he can. And the dog walks on the water, leaping right over the wave, on top of the water, fetches the stick and he brings it back. The other guy's disbelief. It's like, what? So he repeats it twice. And the owner of the dog looks at me, smiles pretty proudly. Says, yeah, what do you think? And the guy says, oh, I see. Your dog doesn't know how to swim, huh? We make light of other things. But envy, it grows out of not just a desire for what somebody else has, but a rejection of where we are. It's an attempt to step outside of the story that God has placed us in rather than embracing it. Despair, even, of where we are. Well, this is key in this episode that we're going to read today. And I'll give you a little bit of background. This comes after the exodus of the Hebrew children in Egypt. They've been they've gone through the 10 plagues. They've marched out of Egypt, across the Red Sea on dry land. They've begun to establish their life there together in these wilderness years. Had the tabernacle built. Tabernacle is like a portable temple that they carry around place to place. They've established the priestly class of how they're going to care for these items, and they've even appointed 70 different elders who are going to help Moses rule over things. So they're starting to establish this life here on their way to the promised land. And we pick up the story here in the book of Numbers, which is in the first few books of the Bible, in chapter 12. I invite you to follow along. Numbers chapter 12, beginning at verse 1. And we start with Moses' siblings, Miriam and Aaron. And then Miriam and Aaron, they spoke against Moses because of the Cushite woman whom he had married, for he had married a Cushite woman. Now, let's pause right there for just a minute. They come to him with a complaint. They say, hey, Moses, you remember from your own mouth we're not to intermingle and marry with the locals? And here you've got a Cushite wife. Cushite, what's that? We don't use that word. Now, that probably about the region of Ethiopia this woman came. There's a lot of commentaries. Was this his original wife, Zipporah? She was a Midianite, maybe she came from Cush. Maybe her father Jethro migrated from Cush to Midian. Maybe that's her. Maybe Zipporah died and Abram took another wife. Maybe he took a second wife. It doesn't seem like he did. That probably would have been noted. The offense here seems to be that she's a Cushite. And you should know this, that term designation could be also used as a general derogatory term for someone with black skin. So they come and say, hey, Moses, we're grumbling. Why you got this Cushite wife? They're upset. And then verse 2, they say this. Is it a fact that the Lord has spoken only through Moses? Has he not spoken through us as well? Now we come to the real issue. They complain about the Cushite wife, but that's not really what their complaint is. Their complaint is that Moses has authority to lead the people, and they think they ought to have it too. They want it too. And isn't that the way it always? I've learned this about church leadership. The Cushite wife is never the issue. There's always something else underneath. And it takes a while for us to figure it out. Quite often, we don't even know ourselves. We need conversation and patience and care for each other to figure out sometimes what it is that really is eating away at us. Well, Miriam and Aaron, they know that they don't like that Moses is the guy in authority. He holds all the power, when, after all, God has spoken to others, too. They've spoken to us, and they're right. God did speak through Miriam and Aaron. And not just the two of them, even the 70 elders. We can read about it in Exodus 4, Aaron being a mouthpiece, in Exodus 12, or Miriam speaking the words of the Lord in Exodus 15, or even in Numbers 11, all those elders of Israel. Yeah, they're right. God had spoken. God distributes his gifts as he will. But they failed to understand, or what they did understand but they didn't like, is that Moses was in a special position of authority. That's how it was. God had set himself as his man, a unique position. That kind of like with where the buck stops with Moses. Well, they wanted a piece of that. They weren't content with where they were. They both had experienced God's call and God's provision and God's equipping them and entrusting and infusing them with gifts and abilities to contribute, but they were not satisfied. So instead of rejoicing in the story that they were in, they began to compare their position to Moses's. And this question reveals what was really at play in their heart. No longer content to be who God made them to be. No longer content to play the role that God had them play. They wanted to swap out. They wanted to change scripts. They wanted Moses' role. And their challenge is not just personal. It's a rejection of God's wisdom in their own life and a rejection of God's plan for leadership of the people of Israel. So it's rebellion, not just against Moses, but in the very first instance, in the deepest chamber of their heart, it's rebellion against God and where they were. This passage, it reminds us that God equips us differently. Well, do you remember last week Hagar discovered that God hears? In fact, she named her son Ishmael, God hears. Well, as we continue to read, Miriam and Aaron learned that God hears as well, too. Let me invite you to pick up the very tail end of verse 2. And now the Lord heard this, their complaint against Moses. And now the man, Moses, was very humble, more humble than any person who was on the face of the earth. That's a funny verse. It sounds as if someone's bragging about Moses' humility. And what makes it even more interesting is the tradition is that Moses wrote this. Well, I think it's probably commentary added by Joseph or another commentator later on. Joshua, I meant, not Joseph. Joshua or some other commentator. So Moses is humble. He receives this. Doesn't blow up. He receives it. Verse 4, and the Lord suddenly said to Moses and Aaron and Miriam, you three, get out to the tent of meeting. They're called to the principal's office. 3 of you, my office now, God is saying. So the 3 went out. And the Lord came down in a pillar of cloud, and he stood at the entrance to the tent, and he called Aaron and Miriam. And when they had both come forward, then the Lord spoke. Now hear my words. If there's a prophet among you, I, the Lord, will make myself known to him or her in a vision. I'll speak to him in a dream. It's not this way with my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my household. With him I speak mouth to mouth, face to face. That is openly, not using mysterious language. And he beholds the form of the Lord. So why were you not afraid to speak against my servant, against Moses? And the anger of the Lord burned against them, and he departed. But when the cloud had withdrawn from above the tent, behold, Miriam was leprous, as white as snow. And as Aaron turned towards Miriam, beheld, she was leprous. She'd contracted this deadly skin disease. And then Aaron turns to Moses. He says, oh, my Lord, I beg you, don't hold us responsible for the sin by which we have turned out to be foolish and by which we have sinned. Oh, do not let her be like a dead person whose flesh is half eaten away when they come out of their mother's womb. So Moses cried out to the Lord, saying, God, heal her, please. But the Lord said to Moses, you know, if her father had only spit in her face, wouldn't she be put to shame for 7 days? So have her shut outside of the camp for 7 days, and afterwards she may be received again. So Miriam was shut outside the camp for 7 days, and the people did not move until Miriam was received again. So things happen really fast here. No sooner do they grumble than God says, I'm going to address this and nip it in the bud. And he says to Aaron and Miriam, look, he's my man that I've appointed. Don't speak against him. But because you have, then Miriam contracts leprosy. And they've already set up the guidelines. If you got that kind of sickness, you can't be hanging about with the crowds and masses. You're quarantined outside of camp, at least 7 days. And look, if she were just unclean because someone had insulted her, spit in her face, she'd be outside for a whole week. So this is no less of an offense, and leprosy is no less of a problem. So at least 7 days she's outside, so she goes out. Well, a couple of things to note here. Why does it only happen to Miriam, not Aaron? Good question. Well, it seems all the indication in the text is that Miriam was the leader, but that it leads with her, and even the use of vocabulary and how this is written in Hebrew suggests she's the leader. And that also makes sense. She's the older one. She's about 8 years older than Moses. She's 5 years older than Aaron. Aaron has already proved himself as the high priest not to be able to withstand much peer pressure. Do you remember what happened when Moses was up on Sinai? The people said, hey, here's a good idea. Let's make a golden calf. And Aaron said, okay. So they made a golden calf. Here it seems like Miriam's saying, hey, why is he the big shot? He's our little brother. We need a piece of this authority. Aaron said, okay, goes along. And Miriam, she's the one who gets leprosy. What do we know about her? Well, she was the big sister. She seems to be single her whole life, and that's in a time when single women didn't have a lot of social standing. In fact, they were somewhat vulnerable, but here she's made her way in the world. She's figured things out. She's been put in a position of being care and influence. She's one of the first prophetess that's named in Scripture. Female prophet is Miriam. She was a musician, a leader, a dancer, a poet. In fact, if you look at the leadership of Israel, you could say Moses represents the law, and Aaron represents religion, the cultic practices of sacrifice and worship, and Miriam carries the arts. Yeah. In fact, there's this beautiful passage in the minor prophet Micah that says this, the Lord speaking, indeed, I brought you up from the land of Egypt, and I ransomed you from the house of slavery, and I set before you Moses and Aaron and Miriam. She was a leader of Israel. But she was not content with her where God had placed her. She wanted something different. She thought she deserved something different. Maybe thought she could even do it differently, and so she fell into envy of her little brother's position. Envy is such a dangerous thing. Let me read a couple quotes to you about this. This one goes back to the 4th century. John Chrysostom, he's Orthodox church father. He says this, as a moth gnaws at a garment, so envy consumes a person's heart. Or Thomas Fuller from the 17th century, envy shoots at others and wounds itself. Isn't that interesting? It's like a boomerang bullet. You think you're taking aim at somebody else, but it only harms yourself. Or if we look outside the Christian tradition, and even later, back to the 5th century BC, Euripides, he says this, envy is the greatest disease among men. And about 100 years later than that, Demosthenes said this, Envy is the sign of a nature that is altogether evil. What a pronouncement. Why such harsh language? Well, I think it's this. We can only be who we are, and we can only be what God calls us to be when we affirm and accept and live into that story that he's placed us in. And envy says, I don't want it. It's no good. That's a bad place to be. There's no good to be had here, and it's not for me. I want that story. Miriam said, I want Moses' life, not my own. And when we're there, man, we can't get very far. One of my favorite philosophers, theologian, Danish guy, Søren Kierkegaard, he says that envy starts when we despair of being ourselves before God. As we rather than resting transparently and with acceptance before God with how he's made us to be, we have lack of faith that he knows what he's doing, and so choose to reject it. He says this, envy is secret admiration. Admire something, some virtue, or some accomplishment, or some position, or some situation, but it can't bear to express that appreciation, admiration, so it turns sour, bitter inside. We can admire folks around us, their situations, their character, their life story, without turning envious. In fact, that's when we admire people's accomplishments and their character, their virtues, their situations, we participate in it with them and celebrate with them without having to reject our own storyline. Here's a one quote from a founding father, John Adams. He talks about this ability to emulate through admiration. He says this passion, while it simply is a desire to excel somebody else or even match them in terms of industry and search for the truth and practice of virtue, when we're inspired by other people to try harder, to do better, to realize our own potential more fully, there's nothing wrong with that. That's emulation. He said, but when it aims at power as a form of distinction, well, then we call that ambition. And we're getting in dangerous territory. And when it is a state of mortification at the superiority of another, well, it desires to bring them down to our level or to depress them even below us, well, then we call it envy, and it's dangerous. The desire to excel another by fair industry or search for truth or the practice of virtue, well, that's a good thing. That's how we spur one another on to love and good deeds, each to be more fully what God's called us to be. That's a good thing. The other, the rejections, leads to death. Well, what's the solution to that? What's an alternative? And the key is found, interestingly, in Miriam's own life, in her own story. What else? Do you know any other stories about Miriam, Moses' big sister? Do you know any stories? Diane knows. Yeah. The earliest one, she shows up on the scene. She's 8 years old. And you might remember that Pharaoh was getting nervous about these Hebrews who were having kids all the time. And they were going to take over. They were going to corrupt Egyptian culture. And so he puts out this evil mandate that the midwives are to kill the male children of all the Hebrews when they're born. Now, fortunate for us and for those kids, families, the midwives didn't go along with it. They said, oh, these women are so robust. By the time we hear that they're in labor, the child's born, and it's all done. We're not even on the scene. Well, that's the situation in which Moses is born. His older brother Aaron's just 3 years old, but he's safe. The ordinance hadn't been handed down yet to kill him. So, and when Moses is born, you remember his mom hides him. She nurses him for 3 months, and then she's like, okay, I can't hide this baby anymore. And what does she do? She takes this incredibly crazy risk. She makes a little basket, sops it up with tar and places the baby in and sends him out in the Nile. When I remember hearing that story for the first time, I could not get crocodiles out of my mind. Here's this baby, and Miriam, 8 years old, is given the job. Hey, watch over your little brother. Now, 3 months she's been with this infant. She loves him. She's enamored with him, infatuated with this little baby brother, and she's the big sister taking care of him, and now her job is to watch what happens. Is she fearful? I would be. Is she curious? Certainly. Does she wonder how God is going to provide for them? Yeah, I think so. Her focus is on what is God going to do next? How is God going to play in this situation to take care of my little brother and help our family avoid unnecessary tragedy? Well, you know the story. Pharaoh's daughter is out bathing, sees a basket, and sends a little servant over to look at it. She sees the baby. Must have been a handsome little guy. Not all babies are. And she says, oh, I want to take him for my own. And then what does Miriam do? Of her own initiative, she's thinking quick, and she jumps right in. And she approaches Pharaoh's daughter. Here's a little slave girl, 8 years old. And she approaches a member of the royal household. And she says, oh, I see you got a really cute baby. If you want, I can find a nursemaid who will take care of him for you. Brilliant. She runs back home. Hey, Mom, guess what? I found a good home for him. And you get to keep raising this baby. Isn't that amazing? Well, wow, great story. We get another moment in Miriam's life, not the only other thing we see from her. And it comes after the Exodus. So they've left Egypt. They've seen God's terrible plagues transpired. They've seen miraculous provision, so much so that their Egyptian neighbors want them to leave and even give them parting gifts. This is it's the word I'm looking for, sly, clever, deceitful. They ask their neighbors, hey, do you have any gold and silver we could borrow, any precious stones? We got to go worship. And the neighbors say, yeah, we want you to get out of here. Take this stuff. And they take it and they leave. They steal it from their neighbors. And they go out. They get not very far, and Pharaoh has a change of heart. He sends his army out, which is pretty impressive and terrifying. They have these war horses and chariots, and they're chasing these families that are migrants on foot, carrying, pulling their carts and pushing their prams full of household stuff, baking equipment and clothes and kids. And here comes this world-class army bearing down on them, and the Red Sea is in front of them, and they say, Moses, you idiot. You bring us out here to die like this, be slaughtered on the shores of the lake? Oh, that we were back as slaves. At least we could have had a meal and gone to bed instead of dying like dogs here in the desert. But God does something miraculous. He inserts a cloudy pillar between the army and the Hebrews. It's a cloud on one side and fire on the other. So they have light at night and the army can't see a thing, like the fog we had last week. It parts the sea and they get through. And when they get on the other side, they rejoice. They look back on what God has done and they celebrate. And in that moment, it says, this is Exodus 15:20. Then Miriam, the prophet, the high priest Aaron's sister, she took up a timbrel, like a tambourine, in her hand, and all the women followed her with timbrels and dancing. And Miriam sang to them, sing unto the Lord, for he is highly exalted. The horse and the rider he has hurled into the sea. Wow, what an incredible story. In Miriam's second big moment, She's finding her identity and her voice by looking back at what God has done. When she was a little girl, she was looking forward to what God would do. And here, as a grown woman, a prophet now, she's finding voice and position and identity in her leadership role by praising what God has done. Looking forward with hope to God's provision, and looking back with gratitude to what God has done. Hope and gratitude. Where have you come from? And where are you going? How has God provided for you in the past? And what are you looking for in the future from God's hand? The remedy to envy is affirming the story we're in and the dynamic nature of it, the moving of it, to look back. Where has God provided for us? And looking forward, and what's he going to do next? Those questions ground us in what our story is and what we are called to do. And each one of us is unique. Each one is gifted in special ways. You know, there's last summer when Laura and I were walking around, I was memorizing some poetry and prayers and little passages, stuff. And one of the poems I memorized was by Gerard Manley Hopkins. I don't know if any of you know him. He was a Jesuit guy, wrote quite a bit. And he has this one poem that talks about the uniqueness and concreteness of every individual creature and how it embodies itself in a way that glorifies God. And not just creatures. Then he moves to humans. And humans have a choice in what they do. And he says that it's in doing that, it's in embodying that we glorify God the Father. Let me recite it for you. It goes this way. It says, as kingfishers catch fire, or dragonflies draw flame as their iridescent colors alight, or stones tumbled over the rim of roundy wells sing, or each plucked string tells, each hung bell's bow swung finds tongue to fling out broad its name. Each mortal thing does one and the same. It deals out that being, indoors each dwells. Selves, it goes, myself, it cries, I am what I do, and for that I came. But I say more, the just man justices, keeps grace who keeps all their goings graces, and acts in God's eye what in God's eye they are. Christ. Because Christ plays in 10,000 places, lovely in limb and lovely in eyes, not his. To the Father, through the features of men's faces. Isn't that beautiful? How does God manifest his glory? It's in being what he's made us to be. That's pretty beautiful. An important lesson there. Here again, these words that Rebecca read from Romans 3. For by grace given to me, I say this to every one of you. Don't think of yourself more highly than you ought, but rather think of yourself with sober judgment, in accordance with the faith that God has distributed to each of you. For to each of us has one body with many members, and those members don't all have the same function. And so in Christ, we, though we're many, form one body, and each member belongs to all the others. We have different gifts according to the grace that each of us has, and if your gift is prophesying, well then prophesy in accordance with your faith. Or if it's serving, then serve. If it's teaching, then teach. If it's to encourage, then give encouragement. If it's giving, then give generously. And if it's to lead, do it diligently. Or to show mercy, well, do that cheerfully. I want to end with just this final little beautiful note. In Romans there, it says we all belong, we're members of one another. Who I am matters not just for my joy and my life and whatever it means, but because I belong to all you. And the same way, too. Who you are matters because we're members of one another. And so we get at the tail end of that story of Miriam. Did you notice what it said? She spent her 7 days in time out. But what does the entire people of Israel do? Now remember, there are people on the move. They got places to go. But what do? They all wait 7 days until Miriam is restored in. We can't move forward without her. She is one of us. Same is true for each one of us. Each story that God has placed every one of us into is the story he wants us to live. And it depends, or it matters. It matters not just to each one individually, but to all of us together. Amen.